Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to Murder One. Thank you so much for joining me. I get to sit down for this little bit of an introduction. My name is Sam Blake, and I'm the founder of the Murder One Festival. And this year we are brought to you by Dun Laoghaire Libraries, which is why we are in this fabulous lexicon venue, and also by the Arts Council, and they're enabling us to live stream. And I'm just talking to the guys at home. We are live streaming, and we have a whole bunch of people watching online, as well as you guys in the audience. And we're able to take questions from the people online. If you want to tweet us at Murder One Fest, we've got a whole Twitter team here who will be able to pick those tweets up and ask our panel your questions. And obviously we'll be coming to our audience later as well. So I am joined this afternoon by an amazing panel who have written and chosen the subject of incredible books, which all share a common theme, which is to do with mothers and children disappearing. Brian McGilloway is a teacher from Strabane. His first novel, Borderlands, was published by Macmillan New Writing and was shortlisted for the CWA New Blood Dagger in 2020. I knew I'd get this wrong. 2007, isn't it? And was hailed by the Times as one of that year's most impressive debuts. He, at The Empty Room, which is the book we're going to talk about today, is actually his 12th book, and he's written various series featuring Inspector Ben Devlin and DS Lucy Black. So quite an experienced author at this stage, Brian. And his books have been shortlisted for pretty much every award, or one shortlisted award, every award there is, which is pretty good going. In The Empty Room, we meet Dora Condren, who wakes one morning to discover that her 17-year-old daughter, Ellie, has not come home from a party. As I speak to these guys, I'm going to ask them to tell us a little bit about their books, so that if you're fans of one of them but haven't read the others, then you're going to get a sense of what those books are about. Claire Allan, who's in the middle here, is an international best-selling author from Derry in Northern Ireland, and her debut psychological thriller, Her Name Was Rose, was published in June 2018 after a string of women's fiction successes. It hit the bestseller charts in the UK, Australia, Canada, and was a USA Today bestseller. And Claire's sixth psychological thriller, In the Dark, is to be released in July 2023. But we're here to talk about The Nurse, which you can see in front of us there. Nell Sweeney is the nurse in question, and she disappears while walking home from work, but her friends and family don't realise until 3 days later. And one of the strong voices in this book is Marion, her mother, and we see things through her eyes. Louise Phillips is a best-selling crime writer who has won the Best Irish Crime Fiction Novel of the Year at the Irish Book Awards for The Doll's House, and that was your second novel, wasn't it? Second book. And each of her other best-selling novels have been shortlisted for the Irish Crime Novel of the Year. And in 2016, she was longlisted for the CWA Dagger in the library. And her first two novels were published in the US to critical acclaim, and her fifth novel, The Hiding Game, is currently under option. We've been talking a lot about options as the day has been proceeding, so we might ask you a little bit about that. They All Lied is her sixth novel, and Louise is also the mastermind behind the crime scene section on writing.ie. Just give that a quick plug for anybody who's writing. And she teaches creative writing workshops throughout Ireland, including the Irish Writers' Centre. Her book features Nadine Fitzmaurice, who is a manager in an insurance company, and she gets a distressed phone call from her 18-year-old daughter, Becca, telling her that she's killed someone. It's quite an unusual twist on that one. And Nadine's life is literally turned upside down. So we've got three authors who've all chosen that mother-daughter relationship to explore in the crime field. And I just want to really get into why and how and why you took that approach. So I've got loads of questions. All the books share a real sense of urgency and a common thread, but literally each one approaches it from a totally different angle. Brian, talk to me about the inspiration for The Empty Room. How did you settle on that?
To be honest, it was an idea I'd had for a while about a parent who loses their child, and it was about looking at kind of the three key points or three key moments. So the book, the first third of it is 3 days after the child goes missing. The middle section is 3 months, and then 3 years. And where it kind of came from, I don't know. I think increasingly as I've been writing, you use writing to face your fears. You use writing to look at what you're afraid of yourself, and possibly as a way to show yourself that it's survivable, that somebody can come through it. And I mean, my wife and I have 4 children, and it is literally your worst nightmare that something would happen to one of them. And I feel like a bit of a fraud because we're on a panel about mothers. And as you will possibly have noticed, I'm not a mother. But I think one of the things, this is also my first book that's not clearly set in Ireland. And I think part of the reason for that was in the writing of it. If it had been a father rather than a mother, and had it been set in Ireland, it would have been too difficult to write.
Yeah, for you.
So having a mother rather than a father just gave me a buffer.
Yeah.
Particularly because it's first-person narrative, and it's very much focused on what's going on in Dora's head and how she's responding to what's happening. And so it was a way to kind of just create a little bit of distance between me and the story. And where it came from, I suspect, my kids are all kind of, they're growing up now. And then 2 or 3 years ago, I lost my dad. And then last year, my eldest son, was going to university, and there was just that sense of kind of grief and loss, and that sense that things were changing. So I suspect that's probably, because my characters have always been kind of psychiatrists and punch bags for me.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and you capture that female voice brilliantly.
Thank you.
I'm going to talk to you a bit about structure later, because I was really impressed with the structure. That 3 days, 3 months, and the 3 years divides the book into 3, and for me it feels like an absolutely perfectly structured book. I was blown away by it, and I was also blown away by the nurse as well. And there was a lot of research in that for you, because it features quite a dark side of a particular community. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the nurse, throughout the nurse, there are 2 points of view that we hear from, and one is Marion, the mother of Nell, but also we hear from a mysterious him. We don't know who he is, he's just known as him. And him has found himself in the incel community, so that's the involuntary celibate community. For people that aren't familiar with it, it's a movement. It sort of seems to have started in America or Canada. It has spread worldwide, and it's men who feel very aggrieved, I suppose, by how the world has changed, how they feel that they've lost a place in it, and the feminism has had a negative effect on them. Now, in the real world, there have been a few mass shootings. There's been a lot of targeted abuse online. It's a very scary world to delve into, and I suppose I wanted to show that it isn't just something that's happening over in America or over in Canada, wherever. It is happening on our doorstep, and it's also, hopefully I've shown that with the character of him, that it's very, very easy for vulnerable young men to get drawn into that world.
Yeah, absolutely. And you explore that it from the mother's point of view, from his point of view, and also from Nell. We see
a bit of Nell as the book goes on.
Yes.
So it's a strange one. When I started writing the book, the voice that was most strongly in my head was him, and I had intended to write a couple of chapters with Marion, the mother. And she was never intended to be a full point of view that ran throughout the book, but she just sort of took over. And I think probably a little bit of what Brian says, it's that sort of, I used her as a bit of a therapist. My children are getting older and talking about going to uni and having their difficulties and whatever else, and I suppose you can explore all your feelings about being a mother and your fears for your children and that, and definitely there's a good wee bit of Marion is reflective of me.
Yeah. I think that we all pick bits of ourselves to put into different characters, don't we? Louise, for you, Nadine Fitzmaurice, have I got that right? I have. Nadine Fitzmaurice. I was talking to somebody the other day about this book, and they went, and they all lied. Yeah. That is basically
kind of the clue is in the title.
The clue is in the title. So just talk to us a little bit about how that story came to you.
Well, it was kind of a weird one because, and like when we were watching Steve's interview earlier on about where ideas come from, but for me it kind of came from 2 different directions. Like we'd seen a lot of, I suppose, gangland crime on TV and things like that. But interestingly, in my life path, I crossed lives with people who I would consider to be not working class, but sort of middle class, upper middle class, who had all been impacted by organised crime, and I felt it was like this silent story. As I said, there was one family, their son was doing very well playing soccer in the UK. He was in the junior team of one of the major Premiership teams there, and his brother got into trouble with drugs, and then, say for example, he built up a drug debt, and what happened then was they targeted the family, and they basically said, you don't pay this money, we're going to basically get rid of your talented son's feet. You know what I mean? So I've just felt that that was an area that I wanted to explore. And then I suppose the other part of it was, I don't know if anybody here remembers the film Flight Plan with Jodie Foster, where she's on a plane and nobody believes that her daughter is missing. Yeah. So I had this sort of thing that, you know, what would you do if you were a mother who their child was in danger and nobody actually believed you? So that was sort of the impetus, those two sort of channels coming together. And then as I kind of got into the story, I think my ambition changed slightly insofar as that I then wanted to create a narrative whereby nobody was actually sure who was telling the truth. So that like it's really at the very end of the novel that you discover. So at different points, characters that you trust all the way along the way become the people that maybe you should have doubted from the beginning. So it kind of became a combination of a number of different things. But again, I think like Brian and Claire's novels, there was that sense of like tempo about it. Everything had to be done like fast, really fast paced, because it was a desperate situation. And as crime writers, we just love putting our characters in desperate situations. Yeah. So that was it, yeah, for sure. Because there's nowhere to hide if something's happened to your child. Yeah. You just have to come out fighting.
Yeah, that's literally what happens to Dora, isn't it? Mm. She discovers the...
Yeah, and I suppose it is that idea of, as writers, there's a real control thing. I mean, I think writers are all control freaks. I don't know if anybody would disagree with it. And it is, I mean, I wrote my first book, I wrote Borderlands, just around the time that our first son was born. And it was very much that sense, and it was kind of stupid because throughout Tanya's pregnancy I'd been quite nervous and quite worried, and then whenever the baby was born I remember thinking stupidly and naively, well, that's grand, all the worry's done now. And then it hits you, and particularly whenever you feel like things are going out of control. From a writing point of view, writing allows you to impose control in that world, and while the real world may well be totally chaotic, in your fictional world, you can decide what happens. You can ensure that there's some form of justice, that people, the right people are punished and the right people are rewarded. And I mean, that's Greek tragedy did exactly the same. Shakespearean tragedy does the same thing. I'm not claiming that my book is either of those, but I think there's a thread that runs through literature, particularly literature which encourages catharsis, that allows us to face fears, and to see how we would respond from a distance, from kind of being able to take a step back from it. And I think genre writing is very good at that. And I mean, horror does exactly the same thing. And so, yeah, I mean, Dora, as I think both Claire and Louise have alluded to, what we do as writers is you take a character and then you put them into a horrible situation with the hope that they will be able to work their way out of it. And you kind of hope that they will, and if they do, that gives you a sense of comfort that the same thing might happen in the real world, even though, unfortunately, it tends not to.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm slightly chuckling here because I'm always talking to people about how you bring life into your books, and when you write something, how you use a little bit of what you know. And I think you might have just hit the nail on the head with the control freak thing. I think we're all a bit like that, aren't we? And it's so true because you can control the narrative of a book, and I think that's why people enjoy crime, because they know you're in control as an author, and no matter how awful it gets, and particularly in your book, Claire, it gets pretty grim, doesn't it? But you're in control, and so we trust you to bring us through. We don't know what the conclusion's going to be or what the twists might be, but we trust you to take us through. But it's a bit creepy, isn't it?
It's very creepy, and I think one of the creepiest things about it is that it's very believable, and you can see that there's nothing fantastical about it. You can see how very easily a situation like that can escalate. Especially a lot of it, the character of him gets an online following, and as we all know, people who use the internet maybe aren't always the most sane and rational people, and it can attract sort of the crazier side of the world, and people who adopt a different personality online and can say really, really vile things. So this, young man is being spurred on by this online following. And I think we all know of incidents where that has happened, or we've seen something in the news, and that's what makes it so terrifying. But I know a lot of people have said they find it too terrifying, and I suppose I struggle a wee bit with that. But at the same time, when I was writing it, I was completely in control. If
Yeah.
I hadn't been in control of it, maybe I would have felt very differently. But I could put them in really, really dark situations, and I could make it as horrific as possible. And I suppose all I did was explore, if Nell was my child,
Yeah.
what's the worst thing that I think could happen to her? What's the worst fears that I could have? And explore all the way, particularly as mothers, we question ourselves and we blame ourselves for things. That really comes onto it as well.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there about the relatability and how it could all happen, and that's
Yeah.
exactly the same as Louise, you were just saying there about, mother, something happening and not being believed, and that feels so possible.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that, why I'm drawn to writing crime fiction, and I think to some degree a lot of readers kind of relate to it as well, is because by and large you're placing relatively ordinary people in extraordinary situations. And so, like, say, with Brian's novel and Claire's and my own, each of the characters, Nadine, Marianne and Dora, they are just regular, ordinary, I'm not just anything like a regular, ordinary mother, but they're a regular, ordinary person. And so they're dealing with this world that they've never been exposed to before. So there's no rule book. And I think it's really interesting, when the chips are down and characters are put under pressure, sometimes the characters that may appear initially quite weak individuals, because, like, I think, you were right in the opening segment, we all deal with a similar issue, but we open the door in very different and unique ways. But one of the correlations that I felt was that each of these sort of main protagonists of women were people that to some extent had been undermined or not been able to fully live the lives that they're able to live. And by nearly the most worst thing in the world happening to them, like their true selves, their kind of fighting selves, came true in each of the manuscripts. And that's what I felt was enjoyable for me, to bring Nadine on this particular journey whereby nobody believed anything she said, and everything that she thought was her life was questioned. And invariably, as with the other books, there's this backstory, this history that sort of comes up to sort of take her by the hand and say, listen, there's stuff happened in your past that you can't forget about, and there's stuff happening in your life now that you need to face. And I think that was sort of a correlation between each of the manuscripts as well.
Yeah, it's definitely a theme, because that's exactly what happens to Dora, isn't it? And she discovers things as she's looking for her daughter, and she's searching for Becca, is it? Becca?
Ellie.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I knew I was going to do it. I didn't want to go back and find the notes. She's searching for her. She then discovers dark things about her own situation.
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose that
Sorry, I'm being vague, so I don't want to give any spoilers.
No, but I understand where you're coming from.
guess.
But I mean, there's a number of cases every year where you hear of things that have been uncovered, where people are charged with things that were uncovered because of something completely innocuous.
Yeah.
And I remember there was one case in England a couple of years back where a child went missing, and the father then ended up getting arrested over a totally unrelated. Again, I don't want to say what it is because it does feed into the book, but a totally unrelated crime that became uncovered because the police seized the computers of the family to see if the daughter had been in communication with somebody, and then discovered stuff in the computer. And I like that idea that Dora is I mean, it's kind of set, it's based around the Pandora's jar or Pandora's box idea. And Pandora, like Eve, you have to feel sympathy for, because kind of literature and history have made them the villains. Pandora unleashed war and disease and everything onto the world because she couldn't stop being nosy, according to mythology. But she was made to do that. The jar was made to be opened. And not only did she unleash all of that onto the world, but she also unleashed hope, eventually. And so I think there needs to be a kind of a, perhaps a re-examination of the way the particularly female characters, and I'm probably not the person to be doing it. I mean, I said at the start I feel like an imposter.
Well, no, you're right, but you're right. You wouldn't know. If you picked up your book and didn't have the cover and didn't know that you were Brian, you would have no idea that it was written by a man. I mean, really,
Oh, thank you.
You absolutely have nailed the female voice. I mean, and that takes some doing. It really,
Thank you. Thanks very much.
I was just saying that to Claire, you know, beforehand that, you know, I mean, obviously we know Brian is male, but he did, I would, that, his voice for Marianne, or sorry, for Dora was a completely solid,
wasn't it? All the way
maternal
through.
voice.
I'm kind of caught between being complimented and feeling slightly uncomfortable with the direction of this entire conversation is going. Let me tell you.
This is a whole
well, thank you very much. I
A
appreciate
whole-
that.
a whole-
In fairness, what happened with the writing of the book, unusually, my wife read it as I was writing it, because the book was written during lockdown, and it was the quickest of all the books that I've written. It took about 40, I think it was about 48, 49 days.
Wow.
In first draft.
Yeah.
And what was happening, both Tanya and myself were teaching, so we were kind of teaching online from 9 in the morning. So I would get up about 6 and kind of do a chapter between 6 and half 7, and then Tanya would get up at half 7. She would read it as I did. So she would kind of read what I had written that day, and then the two of us were teaching then from 9 o'clock in the morning. But it was useful even because there were times where she would go, not 100% convinced by that. Or even just if she got to the end of it and went, oh, what's going to happen next? Then you knew, right, well, that's working. No, it was fraught with the potential for divorce. We locked together in a house with 4 children. It had potential to go very badly wrong. And I don't know if we do it again. No, and we haven't done it with. I haven't done it. Generally speaking, nobody reads the books until it's finished. So it was unusual for me to do it that way, but I think it helped the book.
Oh, it was very impressive. How long did it take you to write The Nurse, Claire?
Do you know, I actually don't remember because they all sort of bleed into one, but it was a very intense write, and I loved writing it. So once I get under the voices and got the voice right, when I'm writing, I tend to write this first 10, 20,000 words a couple of times until I get that voice just right. And once I got into it, it wrote itself. It really did feel, at times I would sit down and I wouldn't feel as if I was writing at all. And I know that sounds really...
No, but that means you're in the zone, doesn't it? Because the characters have taken over and it's doing its thing.
The voices, to me, were so strong to write that it just went with it, and they were just there. It was a joy to write. For something that's so dark and so scary, it was a really enjoyable experience, which I know sounds
a bit bizarre,
weird,
but
it really was. As a writer, it was that kind of euphoric.
Yeah.
You just sit and you look, and there's 5,000 words on your screen, and you don't really remember doing it. Yeah. That's when you know it's working properly.
Yeah, that's the joy of being a writer. I think the fact that we write crime is incidental in that, but it's obviously we all do, and it's and it is that moment when you hit the zone, isn't it? It's fascinating to hear about your process. I'm really interested in that 20,000 words, a couple of goes to try. Alex Marwood talks about writing the stuff before she even sits down to write a book, and it could be 40,000 words of stuff, she calls it. So she's taking the pressure off herself about, this is the first draft, this is just the stuff, and finds the story. And it sounds very similar, that you keep going until you get it.
I know that it's the right voice, and I can think I've got it, and then just go, no, there's just something not right. And it usually takes maybe 3 or 4 attempts before I go, I'm finally on the right path with it, and I can just fire on from there. And by that stage, I suppose you know your characters so well, inside and out, that it sets you up really well for writing the rest of the book.
Can I ask actually all of you actually, do you use writing? Because that kind of tuning fork moment, that idea of having the right note that opens the book, I tend to get from music. Do you listen to music when you're writing, or do you write in silence? Either Louise or I'm just interested. Actually, probably
Louise,
all a bit different.
I wouldn't normally no, but actually on the online I listen to a lot of Adele for some reason, and I think it's kind of going back to your question about how long books can take. I would say this was the fastest book I ever wrote, but it took me the longest time because, as sometimes can happen in life, real life gets in the way. So I found myself kind of in the zone, and then for months on end, not being able to go back to that fictional world. But it was interesting because that wouldn't have normally been my process. And so when I went back in, say, the second time round, when like you've your first draft done, and your first draft is never your first draft, because like Claire was saying, you know, you rewrite and rewrite it. But when I went back in after a period of time, I think I saw things that I wouldn't have been able to see if I hadn't had that gap in
That
time.
distance can be really useful.
You know, so it was useful for me. And then I think by nature of the type of story it was as well, you know, you're like, as you know, with crime fiction, there's always a sense of anxiety hovering. But because of the themes involved, you know, in these 3 books, you know, everything was frenzied. So you nearly had to kind of pick up the tone of the book when you were writing it and become almost frenzied yourself, if that makes sense. But blame Adele if you don't like it.
Did Adele help that, or was it a kind of counter?
I think what it was, like I had like one of her albums that I just kept playing over and over, and I think it was no disrespect to Adele because I think she's great, but I think it was just that I needed something to block out the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Really,
Right,
for
okay,
me,
yeah.
you know what I mean? As opposed, but I know lots of writers who use music.
Yeah. No,
you
it's
know,
it's very interesting. It's I used when I was writing the Cat Connolly books, I listened to the soundtrack of her music, and just like, because she listens to pop music because she's a lot younger than me, and I found that did the same thing, blocked out all the other noise in my head, and so when I switched on, it's nearly like a trigger. I don't know if you where you say, yeah, this is now I'm writing, so this is the thing. And I love that idea of the right note and starting off.
Yeah, although I'm really interested with the both of
first
you can
line.
listen to lyrics, because I can't. I find if I was listening to lyrics,
It would
it would
distract you.
distract the voice. So I tend to listen to like Max Richter or Hans Zimmer or kind of classical crossover instrumental stuff that's not going to bleed in. Film soundtracks actually I listen to a lot. But it's that tuning fork moment. They try to get the right note at the very start.
You see, I need silence.
Right, okay.
I just need, nobody talk to me.
Have you not got
Nobody
2
look
children?
at me. I do too. That's
And a
probably
dog.
why I need
And a dog.
silence so much. And I suppose it's that, because the house is so busy all the time between children and dogs and whatever else. So when I go into my office and close the door, and I have put earplugs in, and it just switches off all that noise. And I suppose it's like it's hitting the right note, but in a different way.
Yeah, it's your
shutting
conditioning.
It's shutting the world out, and
that's my time.
God forbid anybody that comes near me when the earplugs are in.
Yeah.
I've started now putting a sign up in the door too, going like, unless your leg is actually hanging off.
Leave me alone. I think it's really interesting hearing about people's process and, you know, where you write and how you write and those little triggers that you use to get into the zone, because I think you do need that. But we all live very busy lives now, and so being able to literally get into the fiction and immerse yourself, you know, you have to do it very quickly, don't you? We don't have time to fiddle around, you know, an hour to try and get the thing started. You really just have to dive in. I mean, you were talking about teaching there, writing from 6 to 6:30, and then your wife read. That's a very disciplined, like, I'm going to get this chapter done this morning, and then go off and teach. And so you, in that little slot of time, you know that you've got to get that chapter done. Does that help you, knowing that you've got limited amount of time?
It does, because I kind of aim to do about 1,000-1,500 words in a day, and I'll manage it in about an hour and a half.
Yeah.
And to be honest, it's almost there's a compulsion. Like, I think writing is a compulsion anyway.
Yeah.
When people kind of say, "What would you have done if you weren't writing?" It's like, well, that's not a choice.
Yeah,
I feel compelled to do it.
Yeah.
But it's like an itch that needs to be scratched. And once I do a chapter, once I've kind of, no, it depends. On a good day, it might be very itchy, and I have to scratch a lot. Again, uncomfortable where this conversation's going, but you know what I mean. But like, it's that's enough. And quite often, I'll kind of get to the end of a chapter and go, "Yeah, that's okay." Kind of feel now I'm done for the day. Can be normal and talk to people.
Yeah.
Sometimes if you carry on, if you think, I've done it really quick today, and you carry on because you think I can push it, you actually end up over egging the pudding a wee bit. Sometimes it's best to go, I know my optimum is, for me, if I get 2,000 words done in a day, that's a brilliant writing day. It can go either way, but generally if I try and write more than 2,000 words, it tends to
go off
But the thing about it as well is that even though, like, let's say you cut off at 2,000 words or after 2 hours, like, you don't actually stop, which is important, because you sort of you sort of engage with the rest of life, or you might go for a walk or whatever it might be, but somewhere in your head you're still thinking about the story. And sometimes it's important to actually get distance from the story, because I know, I've started the first draft of the next book, and again, because of just personal circumstances in life, I was sort of not able to get to the writing desk. But when I actually got to the writing desk eventually, like within a week, I had like 10,000 words down. But it's because those voices, they were there. Like just because they weren't on the page, it didn't mean that they didn't yet exist.
Yeah.
And so it was actually like we are probably all a bit crazy writing, but it actually felt like such a relief to actually get
to let
these
them out.
voices on the page.
Yeah.
And they weren't half bad, which really surprised me, you know. But I think a lot of writing is, you know, what goes on when you're not actually doing the
That's
writing.
so true. It's that percolation, isn't it? As the story develops and the downtime. You're never away from the story. It's whatever you're doing. I think a lot when I'm driving. It's not very good always. Sometimes I'm in the wrong place. But do you find? I had this, as you were saying about you teaching and your wife reading, and then I had this vision of while you're teaching, the story's still going around in both of your heads.
Yeah,
And
completely.
and then coming back to at the end of the day to discuss it.
Yeah, and I mean, as Louise says, you're never not thinking about it, and you wake up in the morning and it's the first thought in your head.
Yeah.
And generally, actually, when you wake up, your head's been up for about half an hour before you.
Yeah.
And is already having a full-on conversation. So it is, it's obsessive, which is possibly why I tend to write quite quickly, because especially if it's a darker story, you're carrying it around in your head all day and you really don't need it.
Yeah.
Whereas if you write it down and kind of get it out, when you finish the book, you can then let go of it.
Yeah.
And so it kind of gives it gives the impulse to write. And I never know how the book's going to end, ever. I've only ever known in one book how it would end.
It's very interesting.
And changed the ending halfway through because I thought I'd made it too obvious. And part of it is, I think, because if I knew how it was going to end, I wouldn't have the impulse to write it. I wouldn't need to write it because I know how it's going to end.
Yeah.
And ultimately, you write a story for yourself first.
Yeah.
And then you hope that other people might engage with it and like it as well. But you're your own first audience, and if you know how it's going to end, then there's not the same compulsion.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. It's not going to surprise the reader.
Yeah.
That's how I feel. So Brian and I talked about this a few nights ago, that I think maybe only in one of my books has the person I originally thought was going to be the killer still been the killer by the end of the book.
Yeah.
Because I think as you get to know your characters a bit more, you get to think about the situation a bit more, you can get a wee bit more twisty on it.
Yeah.
And make more. But yeah, it always has to surprise me otherwise.
Well, it's very true. If you don't know what's going to happen, there's no way anybody's going to guess. We hope, when you read through. So, and I need to come to you, Louise, and ask you, but just I want to ask Brian, did you not know then what was going to happen to Ellie at the end, or not know how it was going to pan out?
I knew what was going to happen to her, but I didn't know why it had happened.
Why it happened.
Or how it happened, or who caused it to happen. Sorry, this has been really vague. And to be honest, I don't need to be vague because John Connolly's quote in the front says a study of grief.
Oh, yeah.
So it's probably not a massive surprise.
Yeah, what happens.
And to be honest, part of it is because there's so many crime novels where you're reading it and good always wins.
Yeah.
And the unfortunate thing is in real life,
it doesn't always happen that
way. It doesn't happen that way.
Yeah.
And so it was, I kind of knew from the start that it was going to be a study of grief.
Yeah.
And it was going to be, and particularly I suppose that structure then comes from, because of the whole kind of wake tradition that we have in Ireland, in those first 3 days, everybody's around you and you're distracted and it's all unreal, and about 3 months people stop contacting, people forget that your world has changed because their world's exactly the same. And that's when the loneliness kind of hits you then, when you realise, well, everybody else has just moved on and I'm still here and there's still this gaping wound. And then 3 years was that moment of that her life has not necessarily moved on, but she has kind of reconciled herself a little to what has happened. So
very interesting. I'm fascinated by this process. And so while we're talking about structure, Louise, how did you make a decision about what way to structure your story? Like, how did you have options as you were going through? Because Claire's written her way in and found her voice, I suppose. How do you approach that?
Well, I think I'm not someone who actually plans or plots out their novel. She says, and I'm actually thinking about doing an outline plan for my current novel. But I think I just wanted to sort of really push the character, and so things happened, throughout it, and then Going back to what Claire and Brian said as well, is that when you don't actually plan out or plot your stories, this kind of question of like, what if and what's going to happen next, and then things happen that sort of surprise you too, and like there's quite a number of twists in They All Lied, and some of the twists came to me by surprise, and again it was a little bit like Brian says, I do some of my best thinking in the mornings, and there was one particular twist in it that I had no idea. It's a little bit like Claire was saying, she had no idea who the killer was. I had no idea up until the point that this twist came to me, that this is what had happened in this character's life, and this event happened this way, not the way everybody else thought it was going to happen. And so that's really exciting, and it's particularly exciting because it really has to fit for the people in this fictional world. When it fits and it makes sense, you go, absolutely. It could never have been any other way. But like, interestingly, as I say, this time I've plotted out the novel. I had 93 chapters outlined, so it's bound to be a complete disaster. But going with what Claire said, like, I got the first sort of 20 to 25,000 words down, and at that point then, it's sort of slightly different to other processes. I knew who each of the characters were, and so when I sort of was thinking about plotting and planning, I wasn't actually thinking about telling the story as such. It was sort of like, it was kind of like, as Sophie Hannah refers to, as story architecture, that you kind of develop this architecture around the story. But now you actually write the real story, if that kind of makes sense. But They All Lied was just, literally what's going to happen next. And the best question of all is, what if? What if this character isn't who they say they are? What if this happened? What if the person that you trust the most isn't the person who you should be trusting at all?
It's fascinating listening to the way you approach it and the process. And I'm really interested in the fact that none of you knew the ending. I like to have a scene in the end. I don't know necessarily what happens at the end, but I like to have a scene. I feel very secure if I'm writing towards something. So the scene at the end of Remember My Name, there's a big swimming pool scene, and I knew something happened in a swimming pool. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I could see the water, the blue of the water. And one of the Cat Connolly books ends at St Pancras Station, and I could see this station, but I didn't know really what happened. So it's fascinating. I think comparing notes and structure, we all learn from each other, don't we? I'm really interested in your 93 chapter plot. That's very detailed, isn't it? How's it going to?
But it was strange because there was like a momentum with it that I wouldn't have felt before when I ever attempted to plot or plan, and so I'll tell you this time next year whether it worked or not,
I think it's great to stretch yourself as a writer, though, isn't it? It's great to be able to take something and say, well, look, I'm going to try it this way, it's a bit differently. So you hadn't plotted out. Did you know you were doing it in those three sections when you started, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I from the start, I kind of first pitched this book to my agent, I think about 6 years ago. And it said, I want to do this book, and it's about a mother who loses her daughter, and it's broken up into the first 3 days, 3 months, 3 years. That was all I knew about it. And at the time he went, ooh, that sounds really bleak. Not sure anybody's going to want to read it. He may well have been right. But it took me a couple of years to work out where the hope was and to work out where the redemption was. Because I was aware of the fact that it needed to have some hope. There needed to be something at the end that suggested the potential for things to get better. So it took me kind of 5 years to work out how to tell it, but that's not that unusual for me. I don't know if you are the same, or if you have an idea and you write it straight away. For me, quite often I'll have a vague idea, but then it sits for quite a while before
it needs to brew. Did yours brew, Claire? Did you, or did you just?
Didn't really.
It just stuck straight in, and that was it.
It just went straight in. There have been a couple that have sort of, maybe it would just be a line that would stay with me for a while, and I think it's going to be one book, and that might be 3 books later that actually becomes something. But
something quite different.
I'm not one of these writers that people say sometimes writers that you must have so many ideas. Nope. I don't. One at a time, and every single time that I finish a book, I go, well, that's it. They're all used up. I'm in trouble now. So, and I have to wait a while to this new voice or whatever comes into my head, but certainly there's no big filing cabinet of I'm always astounded when I see authors saying that. Oh, there's another book chomping at my heels, and I'm going,
Yeah, well,
Lucky you.
worrying process. And what was the very first bit that came to you with this book? Why did you start? Why did you start with those 20,000 words?
Well, the first where this book came from is, and you'll see at the start of the book, it's an actual Twitter post that went viral. It was from an incel forum, and it was a young man suggesting that you might get a thrill from following a woman walking alone down a street at night, and he described it as harmless psychological fun. Yeah.
Creepy in itself.
And I just thought, yeah, let's just take this to a whole other level, and because every single woman has had that moment walking home at some stage where they've got their car keys in their hand, or they're a little bit nervous as they cross the street. And I wanted to examine not only the fear that women have about that, but also how that must feel as a man to see a woman cross the street in front of you because she's scared of you, and you're just walking down the street like anybody else. So that was really where it came from, the duality from that Twitter post.
Yeah, I find the inspiration for books fascinating. I was asking Steve Kavanagh about it earlier in the last session, what's his first, what's the bit that gets there? Because often it can come as a character, it's a phrase, it's a line, your note. Do you start with the first line sometimes? Does that come?
Yeah, well, I normally start with the situation, so I normally have a
Sorry,
sense
that was a really stupid question. Do you start with the first line? Obviously, you start
No,
with the first line.
no, but I understand what you mean.
You know what I mean?
I understand what you mean
I
by
thought it was
that,
explained for everybody else.
I'll normally have a sense of the situation.
Yeah.
Particularly with the Devlin books, I would have a sense of where he's standing.
Yeah.
And kind of the geography of that and the weather around it. I remember somebody asked me why I write about clouds so much.
That's interesting.
Because I know absolutely nothing about them.
No, but it's just...
But yeah, so yeah, I think the situation and kind of where the character's located.
Yeah.
And then maybe work it out from then. What's
that
going on.
image of where to begin. And do you start like that, Louise? Do you start with the?
Yeah, well, I think the process can vary with each of the books. I know
That's
They All Lied, you know, I had this kind of, as Brian said, situation where there's this woman and she's carrying on with her seemingly ordinary life, and she gets a phone call, and there's something about the phone ringing. She has this sense that this is the phone call that you've been dreading your whole life, you know. And as you introduce the book, you know, her 18-year-old daughter is on the phone and she's been held captive, but she's also killed someone. So there's that sort of
double whammy, really.
Double dilemma, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And actually writing that opening chapter, you know, it's very hard to kind of, where do you drop this on the page, you know? Would you just drop it? Like, it's a little bit like, I remember somebody asking a writer that I have a lot of respect for, you know, how do you write about sex? And he said, the same way as you write about anything else. So, like, in this woman's fictional world, the line that her daughter had just killed somebody was dropped upon her. So that's sort of the way it's presented in the opening. So I had this thing, you know, whereby, you know, there's a particular time on the clock, and then 5 seconds later, her world has changed. 5 seconds later, or whatever, her world has changed even more. And then the whole crescendo of the journey she needs to go on is like on a roller coaster ride, yeah. But again, as Brian said, that kind of opening situation was there, and you know, where does this go?
Yeah,
doesn't go anywhere good for a while.
No, exactly, for a bit, yeah. And Claire, I can hear her walking down the street in the dark. You can hear the footsteps, can't you? Even as you say it.
You can just, because we've all been there, and I can imagine. I know that it was kind of misty rain. I know that, and it was all there. It was right in my head, and in terms of marrying the mother's character, it's a bit like Louise. She's just an ordinary woman. She's coming in, she's putting the dinner on, and things go upside down for a long time, and you're straight into the action, and you're straight into the adrenaline and the fear, and it's just important to show that I think we all know, every single person, obviously not relating to kidnap or murder or whatever else, but we've all had moments where 1 minute everything is normal and boring even, and you're like wondering what you're going to watch on TV that night, Bake Off's on or something, and the next minute, boom, your world has exploded.
Changed.
So I always just like looking at that and the impact that it can have and how people come back from that moment.
Yeah, fascinating. And 3 really strong maternal voices, 3 great women, and really interesting because you're taking the stories in completely different directions, as we said at the start. I'm going to see if the audience have any questions. I could talk to you all day. We start to end up, when you ask questions like, you know, did you begin with the first line? That's a real writery question, and you have to translate it for everybody else. We could sit here and natter. I think Catherine is on the microphone here, and if anybody has any questions, and we'll see if we've got any coming in from online too. Oh, there's one at the back there.
Just to you all, I'd be interested to know what you watched growing up, crime series and stuff like that. Do you watch crime at all? Like, is there something that you watch? Is it something you watch yourself to get ideas and things like that?
I'll take that first,
Go
if
on.
you like, because like back in the day, like a million years ago when I was a child, like we had black and white TV, and you were really lucky to get a signal where you could see figures on the screen. But as things progressed, I remember like Hitchcock had a series on TV, and we used to watch that as a family, I suppose. I don't know what my parents were doing, letting a young child watch Hitchcock, but there you go. And I still vividly remember scenes from Hitchcock, and I suppose what that might have encouraged me to do was to understand the fear. And Hitchcock himself says, you know, like, good story is life with all the boring bits taken out.
Yeah.
And so his technique of storytelling was quite unique. Like, it was over my head as a young child, but you do recognise good storytelling. And also it kind of fed into the thing that I sort of have experienced when I've met other crime writers who, you know, are generally really big softies. And it goes into my theory of you can't actually write about fear unless you understand fear.
Yeah.
And believe me, I was full of fear watching those Hitchcock serializations. So I don't know whether that's where it started, but it's certainly, I would say, it stayed with me all my life, yeah.
That's an influence. Claire, did you watch or did you read maybe stuff as a child?
I didn't, and I always feel kind of embarrassed admitting this. Brian knows this because I admitted it the other night.
I feel
You can't
I need
tell
to
a
point
lie.
out
It's his fault.
We were doing an event
They were doing an
together
event
the other
together?
night.
Yeah.
And I say this for the benefit of my son, who's sitting in the back row, possibly wondering.
Yeah. I didn't read crime. I didn't really watch crime. I would have watched Taggart with my mum back in the day, but it just wasn't something, because I am the biggest coward in the entire universe. And the only crime books really that I would have read before I started writing were Brian's, because we're both from the same city,
yeah.
and I was working as a journalist, and now every time Brian had a book come out, I'd be like, yes, there's somebody to interview this week, and he would have.
Can I just say that the
dropped
biggest
book down.
coward here was the journalist who did the courts and who covered loads of big inquiries in the north,
Yeah.
like some serious stuff. So you
Well,
weren't that much of a coward.
Well, yeah, I suppose, funny that came up, that so much of that was my day job, and I
Yeah.
could package it as a day job, and it wasn't until I left journalism
Yeah.
that I really processed a lot of the things that I'd heard and a lot of things that I had seen, particularly in courts and at crime scenes.
And they're all coming out in the books now.
And yeah, it's processing it out now, but it's a lot better because obviously I can control it, and you can't control what you're going to see at a crime scene, and there are certain things that will stay with me to the day that I die. So I probably should never have gone into journalism, being that I was a big coward. But the only reason that I can write crime, given my cowardly nature, is because I can control it.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? Brian, for you?
Yeah, TV. Oh, we'll be here at about 5 o'clock. Airwolf and the Incredible Hulk. As a kid, Incredible Hulk, because it had that amazing Lonely Man theme tune at the end, and because ultimately it was quite tragic. And Airwolf was just, poor Claire has heard this story now multiple times. The very first book that I ever wrote, I was a huge fan of Airwolf. So anyone who doesn't know, Airwolf was a TV program, but a technologically advanced helicopter that somebody had hidden in a hollowed out volcano in Montana, and they used it to fight crime. So the very first book that I wrote whenever I was about 8 was called Skyfox, about a technologically advanced helicopter in Derry that somebody used to fight crime. And I hand wrote it, and I cut pictures out of the paper to illustrate it. And it was the 1980s in Derry, so there was just explosions everywhere. It was just pictures of bombs. But weirdly, as a writer, my dad, I've mentioned a few times, my dad lost his hearing when he was young. And so he tended to watch the ITV dramas, the Wednesday night ITV dramas, because they were subtitled. They were one of the few things that were subtitled on CFAX at the time. So I would have watched Morse and Touch of Frost with him. And I actually didn't read an awful lot of crime whenever I was young. And then just after I finished my degree, No Alibi's bookshop opened in Belfast, and I was walking past and saw an Inspector Morse omnibus in the window. And because I'd watched them all with my dad, I kind of thought, I must buy this and I'll give it to him and he can read it. And then I read it myself first, because that's what you do. And went back and read the 3 books in one night. I went back in the next day and said, what else have you got?
Wow.
And so that was kind of weirdly how I found my way into crime. That was where I started.
That was you smitten.
But yeah, if I had to pick one, The Incredible Hulk, heartbreaking. Heartbreaking TV.
That's a really good question.
That was a great question.
It was a good question. Now, anybody else? Any other? Elaine there.
I was just wondering if you had the kernel for your next books ready, and if you'd share that with us.
Gosh, I'll be loud. Yeah. Next books?
Mine is done, and it's written, and it's completed. Sorry. And it'll be out in January. And it's looking at a missing child again, and a mother relationship. We have a mother, Nora, who took her daughter into the woods for a picnic 7 years ago, and only Nora came back out of the woods, and she can't remember what happened in there. And a true crime documentary maker comes to Derry to try and shed some light on this. So, yeah. It's
that sounds good, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Excellent idea. Brian, do you know what you're doing?
Well, I have one written, but I don't think it's going to be my next book.
Okay.
If that makes sense. I have finished one about a GP who finds a feral child.
Ooh.
He gets called out to a farm where an old man has died, and while he's confirming death, he hears dogs barking, realises this person has been dead for a couple of weeks, and works out the dogs haven't been fed in a few weeks. So he goes out to feed them and realises they're guarding a shed, and there's a child inside the shed. So
creepy.
The problem is it's unrelentingly bleak. So I'm not
right.
entirely sure.
So until you
not
get
entirely sure it's going to be
find
the
the
next published book, but it's done.
Yeah, excellent.
So yeah, not sure what the next published book will be.
Wait and
quite yet.
see. And Louise, you're the 93 chapters, are you?
But like proving that I've absolutely no imagination whatsoever. The idea behind the book is it opens with this 6-year-old woman who decides to run away from home. And I've felt like running away from home quite a few times over the last couple of years. And so it's about that initially, but then very quickly as you get into the novel, you realise that her daughter went missing 30 years earlier. And so it's the story of that.
Interesting. Another mother-daughter book.
Yeah.
Cool. It's an enduring theme, I think. Very a relatable theme, as we mentioned earlier. Oh, me. The next one's The Mystery of 4, out in January, and it's sort of country house rescue meets murder is easy. It's about a lady called Tess Morgan who buys a country pile and at the start of COVID restores it. It's a big stately home, and she gets to opening week and things start to go really badly wrong. So she's invested all her money, everything in this amazing house in Wicklow, and she's getting up and running, and people start dying, basically. That's why it's Mystery 4, you see. You have to unravel the mystery. Any more questions? Have we any online? Yeah, Catherine, do you want to run across?
Hi, everyone. So this has come in from Zoom. Everybody's enjoying watching it online who can't be here. They want to know, does writing about those dark thoughts, those worst nightmares, and putting it on the page, take it out of your head, is like a form of therapy?
Yeah, you're all nodding. I think you mentioned that earlier, actually.
Yeah. Very, very much. You can examine an awful lot, and definitely for me, and I said this earlier, it allowed me to examine a lot about my feelings as a mother. And I think another thing for me is that, like, I'm 46. Brian, I'm going to mention the menopause, right? Sorry for your delicate ears, but at a certain age, as a woman, you're starting to question your identity, and so much of female identity is tied up in motherhood. And I find writing about that mother-daughter relationship is a really effective way. It's sort of examining my feelings about, the fact there are not going to be any more children, and my children are growing up and moving on, and examining who I am now and what the next half of my life is going to look like. Hopefully there'll be no kidnaps or murders or anything in it, but you can push yourself to those places and really consider what it means to be a mum.
Yeah.
And I think also there's sometimes when, going back to writing a story and not necessarily knowing what it's going to be about. I remember one writer saying to me, they only know what a story is about when they get to the end of the first draft.
Yeah.
It's like you're nearly telling the story to yourself. But I know I've experienced certainly in a couple of the novels where I was totally unaware until the end that, let's say, for example, I was covering grief, as Brian was saying, and like, in some ways, like I remember my first novel, which actually did deal with grief. As a writer, I was writing this story nearly unaware, which seems like totally lunatic, but that's the way. And when kind of got to the end of it, I realised actually this character has been following this path, because the grief was a historical grief, so it wasn't completely obvious initially. But I do think that part of ourselves who end up on the page. Obviously, you don't want to be seen. Your characters have to be fictional characters. But there's no doubt that the things that you feel passionate about, the things you worry about, the things you're excited about, all come out through the stories.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think every character, actually. I mean, in the same way that in your dreams, every character in your dreams is a facet of you. Writing feels like dreaming while awake to me.
That's a really good way of
particularly when you
putting
get into
it.
that kind of zone, it almost feels like you're just kind of stepped aside from yourself and you're watching your own dream and recording it.
Yeah.
And in that regard, if your dreams are about processing all the crap that's happened to you in the day, then writing is about processing your thoughts and feelings about the themes you're writing about. And it is a way, I write to work out how I feel about things. It's not that I kind of start off going, I'm really angry about this and I'm going to write about it. I feel something about this, I'm not quite sure what it is. And then writing is a way of exploring how different characters are looking at or responding to whatever the initial situation was. And it's my way of kind of processing my own thoughts and views on stuff too.
Sometimes quite unconsciously, I think. 'Cause, particularly with the nurse, we all have that lull between we submit our book and we do our edits, and then we have this lull between that and publication, and you almost have to read the book again in publication to go out and really sell it. And when it came out and I read it, I came in, oh right, that's what it's about. And it really was, it was a bit of almost like a body blow, some of the stuff in it that I didn't realise just how much I was processing until I read it back with that bit of distance from writing it. So I don't even...
It's really interesting, isn't it? I think because so much writing's done with our subconscious mind that it's the stuff that we've parked, the stuff that we're not aware of, that is what gets processed and comes out on the page. It's really interesting what you're saying there about themes and how you don't necessarily... Do you know your themes when you start writing, Brian?
Not necessarily, no. It kind of comes out, and that's why your question about do you start with the first line, it's a perfectly reasonable question, because quite often you go back and you change. What you think the book's going to be about is often what it's not. I mean, Borderlands, the original idea for Borderlands was that it was about people who were burning old people's homes. Now, in the final draft of it, there is an old people's home and there is a fire. The two are about 5 miles apart. So what I thought the book was going to be about, as I started writing it, I realised it wasn't. Then I had to go back and change the beginning of it again, because the beginning of it had been very focused on what I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think it's fascinating that you find the themes by the time you get to the end, because again, I think it's that subconscious thing going on that you're following the story and you're not thinking about all those bits, but they appear on the page. Don't they? Any more questions from online? Oh, is there a question? Another question in the audience? Just give me 1 second. We might go with an audience question. There we go. I think this might be our last one. We might see if we can get to the other one if we're quick.
Okay, this is to all the panel, including yourself. Just wondering if, of all the books ever published or that you've ever written, which book would you wish that you had written?
Okay, that's an easy one for me, guys. You know mine.
Of every book ever written, which book?
Which book would you? Yeah.
Right. See, this is one of these questions because The Great Gatsby. But if I had written it, it wouldn't be The Great Gatsby. And therefore it would totally defeat the purpose of me writing it. But The Great Gatsby is my book. Gorgeous.
Your
gorgeous
go-to.
book.
Claire?
That's like asking somebody to choose their favourite child.
Yeah.
You know, it's so many different books for different reasons.
Yeah.
It might be a time in my life or a different theme. Do you know, we could say Harry Potter because I'd be really rich.
Yeah.
Would be
This is
one,
true.
you know, but gosh, there's so many books.
We've foxed you with that
Yeah,
one.
yeah,
Yeah.
you've totally foxed me. There's so many, and
No, it's
I'm
good. Good
constantly
question.
in awe of the talent that surrounds
Yeah.
me, and I think, and I have to say, like, the talent that there is in this wee tiny island and crime writers is phenomenal, and the standard is next level, and I think we just need to be so proud of that. And
Yeah.
there's no, I couldn't turn around and go, she's better than he is
Yeah,
or whatever
yeah,
else,
yeah.
because I get so much enjoyment from them.
All of them, yeah. Louise, do you have a favourite?
Well, a bit like Claire, like I do have certain books that stick with me, but like I'd be slow to actually name a book because I think it depends on where you're at in your life as well. But also, I think one of the things that strikes me, because like writers are readers, and when I read a book and I get excited and I think, oh, this is a fresh way of looking at something or exploring a particular theme or whatever it might be, that excites me. And then I think, well, what other difference, you know, can I bring to my writing? So it's not that you'd ever copy another writer or anything like that, but like when writers think outside the box, it's really encouraging because, you know, we're all writing about stories, but it's
learning,
finding
yeah.
that unique way to really capture the kernel of the thoughts in your head, you know. But reading is good enough for pleasure.
Yeah, it's fascinating,
Yeah.
isn't it? Yeah. For me, it's you do. It's Rebecca by Daphne
Yeah, I know.
Maurier for
I was
me.
going to say
Everybody
Rebecca
knows
as
that
well.
now. I love that book. It's, to me, it's like it's the most perfect book because it's multi-layered. It's a romance. It's a crime. It's got everything in
It's one of
it.
the few books that I could read over and over.
Over and over, and you
that
learn
is-
something, you
yeah.
see something different every time
Yeah,
you
yeah,
read it. Yeah,
yeah.
so it's probably like, a bit like the Great Gatsby in that sense that it's
Yeah,
it's
but
layered
it's just gorgeous
themes.
too. It's the language, and
Yeah.
you just you
Yeah.
kind of pause at the end of every sentence. It's,
I know. God, if I'd written that.
If
Where
only.
do the words
Such
come
an
from?
English teacher.
I know. Yeah,
maybe that's what it is. Yeah,
this is the thing. Is
yeah,
that
but
you,
it's a book like it's one that I have taught. I would
Yeah.
say probably about 20 times.
but with passion
And
too.
every single time I teach it, I'm
Yeah.
excited about
Yeah.
starting to teach it again,
But that's
and I find
wonderful.
something different in it.
You're the
and-
perfect
Wuthering
English
Heights
teacher.
is another one that
Yeah.
haunts me from my
Wuthering
child.
Heights,
Yeah,
yeah,
I love it.
yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, it's good.
And
yeah.
you see it differently at every stage of life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the writing in it is
Oh,
just
good one. Yeah. So there are some recommendations for you. Thank you so much to my panel, to Brian McGilloway, Claire Allan and Louise Phillips. And thank you for being a brilliant audience and for some fantastic questions. And thank you to the guys online for joining us and for rolling in your questions there too. This evening, we have Anne Cleves coming in very shortly, I think. And we will look forward to a fantastic day tomorrow. We have even more packed events. So if you are not booked in for tomorrow, do have a look at them and see if you can come again tomorrow. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.